here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to what could be the first roadblock in President Obama's efforts to normalize diplomatic relations with Cuba for the first time in half a century. Earlier this month, Republicans said they would not mount a challenge to Obama's plan to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, a move that could come as soon as next month. But then on Tuesday, Republican Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, a Cuban-American who represents South Florida, proposed legislation to stop new travel to Cuba from the United States. The bill would block the licensing of new flights and cruise ships routes to Cuba if the landing strip or dock is located on land confiscated by the Cuban government.
The measure is attached to the Transportation Appropriations Bill and could prompt a veto by President Obama. This comes as another group of lawmakers has introduced a bill that would end all restrictions to Cuba. Well, for more, we're joined in our New York studio by Tom Hayden, longtime activist, former California state senator, just published his new book called Listen, Yankee, Why Cuba Matters. It's based in part on conversations with Ricardo Alarcón, the former foreign minister of Cuba, past president of the Cuban National Assembly. You can read the introduction to the book on our website at democracynow.org. So why Listen, Yankee now? I mean, you were writing this and coming out with this before this very surprise announcement. Were you surprised?
No, I had an intuition that this was going to happen in 2013. I had visited Cuba several times, and I'd met Ricardo Alarcón, and he had actually interviewed me in 2006 about participatory democracy and the history of the New Left and the history of the many North Americans like myself who had opposed the embargo and supported better relations with Cuba. And I went back in 2013 because I thought that there was a legacy factor that the Raul Castro and Fidel Castro on the one side and Barack Obama had reasons for wanting to resolve this endless dispute within the framework of their presidencies, to leave a legacy, that it was time. There was no more explanation based on Cuba being an agent of the Soviet Union. The Obama administration really needed to improve relations with Central and Latin America. Our country had become isolated from the region. Cuba had become fully integrated into the region. And the way to better relations with Latin America was through Havana. And Obama saw that in meetings that he had with people. So I thought it was going to happen, and I started interviewing people on both sides, including very high-level members of the Obama administration, former Clinton officials, Kennedy officials, Carter officials, and the clues were there, but it was a tightly kept secret. So I started writing the book as if this was going to happen, and then I finished, and it hadn't happened, and then it did happen as the book was to go to press. So I rewrote the first 50 pages to describe how it actually had come about, and
how had it?
Well, the good thing about this is you can read the book, take it to Cuba, and decide for yourself. Despite Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, travel is being expanded. You will be able to use your credit cards. The beaches will be open to tourists instead of tanks. History I think, is finally moving on. It shows you how painfully, agonizingly slow and at what cost any significant gains are. I know progressives don't declare victory because they always have the gloomiest possible twist on everything. One thinks that they're going to snatch this away with this amendment to a bill. Maybe, but I don't think so. I think this is going forward. There will be bumps, history has a lot of parents. I don't know the exact reason everybody decided to do this, except the political will to overcome the obsolete comes to mind.
Well, Tom, the amazing thing in your book, you go through this really detailed history of Cuban-U.S. relations in modern times, and you put at the center of it as the main protagonist of the book, Ricardo Alarcón. And in our conversation last night at Barnes & Noble's, you talked about what a tragedy it is that most Americans really don't know who Ricardo Alarcón is, even though he's perhaps one of the most important diplomats in terms of the 20th century. Could you talk about him and his role, how you first got to meet him?
Yeah, no, it's a tragedy for us because we're actually embargoed from reality by this policy. Ricardo Alarcón has been one of the top diplomats in the world for 50 years, and Amy described his credentials. And the fact that people don't know him here is partly due to the fact that he's virtually banned from coming here, except when he was at the UN. People don't interview him. I think you have, but he doesn't come in to meet with the editorial board of the Washington Post or New York Times. That's why no one knows him. And I think he's an interesting person to interview, and we've had about 60 hours of interviews, and I transcribed some of them in the book to create his voice as a companion to my voice, to look over many episodes in our twisted history.
I wanted to go to Ricardo Alarcón. This is from 2013 when we spoke to him, the former foreign minister of Cuba and past president of the Cuban National Assembly. I asked him to talk about meetings Cuban authorities had with the FBI in Havana to talk about the threat posed by the militant Cuban exile groups here in the United States.
Well, there were several meetings, in fact. René was referring specifically to one that took place in Havana in July 1998 after some private exchanges between the two countries, the two governments, including President Clinton and a very well-known writer, Garcia Marquez, who served as a go-between between us and them. They came down here and they got a lot of information. Recordings, videos, details of terrorist plots and the addresses, the phone numbers, everything. So much that at the end of the meeting, the FBI officials thanked Cuba and said that they will need some time to process that information and they will go back to us. They never went back to us. They did act against the five clearly to help, to protect the terrorists. That is the substance of this process, of this trial.
That was Ricardo Alarcón in 2013 on Democracy Now! He was joining us by Democracy Now! Video stream from Havana, Cuba, sitting next to one of the Cuba Five. Or he was talking about the Cuba Five, who actually have now been released. And maybe you can talk about that. He made that his mission to get these men freed from U.S. prisons. Talk about who they are.
Well, nobody thought that was possible. Everything turns out to be sometimes possible. The five who were arrested for being Cuban spies sent to the United States to monitor the activities of other Cubans who were armed and who flew out of Opalaca Base in Florida to attack Cuba. In other words, our country, would take this slowly, our country was sheltering Cuban exiles who were at virtual war with Cuba. And the Cuban Five were arrested for monitoring those flights. And they got double life in one case, long prison sentences. So they were the subject of tough bargaining in which it took about a year, but the Obama administration finally was convinced that Cuba was serious about the need to get these five back. They let two go, and there were three remaining. and the trade, so to speak, it couldn't be, you couldn't use the word trade, but it was to get back Alan Gross, who was in a Cuban jail for having taken, I think, 5 trips to Cuba, smuggling high-tech communications devices and equipment to the Jewish community there, and I think to a Masonic lodge, all supposedly innocent, but not many people carry luggage filled with high-tech communications equipment in their bag. And so Gross was returned here at the same moment that the 3 remaining of the Cuban 5 were returned there. That was crucial to the deal because that was something that the United States wanted really badly. And you notice the issue has kind of gone away. I don't hear the Cuban right in Congress screaming about that because they would have to deal with Alan Gross. You got back your man. Cuba got back their 3. So it's kind of magical how sometimes these issues that could be blown sky high just fade away when the parties want the issue to go away.
We're going to continue this conversation with longtime activist Tom Hayden, former California state senator, one of the founders of Students for a Democratic Society. His new book is Listen, Yankee, Why Cuba Matters. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a moment.